Welcome back to the Marshall Modification Project. My name's Austin Moore. In this series, we explore the history, technology and culture behind Marshall amp modding. It features short clips and full-length interviews with leading amp modders who have shaped guitar tone for decades.
I'm Dan Pratt. Today we're going to be talking to Jason Tong from Headfirst Amps. While we're talking to Jason, please be aware that this is an academic interview, so we will be trying to sit back and let Jason say as much as he can in his own words and try and stay out of the way a little bit. Anyway, we hope you really enjoy this, and let's get on with the interview.
Mr. Jason Tong, we'll start off with the first question, which is a general question. I wonder if you could tell me about your experience modifying Marshall amps.
Yeah, okay. So this was a hobby that kind of turned into an obsession, which then turned into a business for me. That was kind of like, if I, put it into three broad kind of phases, if you like. And the hobby came about because I started getting interested in guitar and hard rock / heavy metal music, probably around about age 11, 12, somewhere around there. And I wanted to learn, I knew I wanted to learn guitar even, then, right? And at school, the only music programs that were available, there was no guitar program, there was bass guitar. So I actually started learning bass guitar in school music program, sight reading. It's kind of like, big band jazz stuff and school orchestra stuff and all that kind of stuff, right? And then with your friends, with your mates, you're starting to put together little kind of, bands and stuff like that. By age 14, I'd kind of got into guitar. Because I was always going to go there. It was just a matter of time. So the early stuff that really influenced me in terms of the sounds that I like the guitar tones that I like, I didn't realize it at the time, but I realized later on in life that all of those bands were using Marshalls. Kind of like, I remember going back and kind of like researching that and realizing that, oh yeah, whether it was AC/DC or Iron Maiden or Judas Priest or Van Halen or whatever, all that kind of stuff, these were all, bands that had that guitar tone. And to this day, I believe that the subjective question of, what makes a guitar sound good? For one person, a good sound is another person's bad tone. You know what I mean? Like, it's a very subjective thing. But I believe that it's based on the kind of the music that you were listening to, the players that you were listening to at that very kind of influential part of your life, and it gets kind of embedded into your DNA, right into your brain. So I went through university and did a physics degree. And I did applied physics, so it was analog, electronics, and digital tech. So that was software engineering, digital hardware, but also because of the time that this was happening, there was a lot of analog electronics taught as well. And as I kind of, my search for tone kind of started to become something that was more about trying to create my own stuff rather than just going in and buying amps and seeing what they were like, because I started to get super curious, like when Dave Friedman, who's become a very good friend of mine now, but when his stuff first started to roll out, I kind of got this amp bug again, because I was hearing straight from those amps, I was hearing those sounds, like that was that, oh my God, that's that kind of high gain Marshall sound, I could hear it. And of course the kind of the circuitry part of like what I knew about circuitry and analog electronics, that was the curious bit of like, oh, how's those tones been generated? You know what I mean? So I started tinkering and got into kind of modding stuff through really just for my own benefit, just because I wanted to see how far I could take it. And then once I started sharing some of my discoveries and some of the things that I'd created, because I got into printed circuit board design as a result of all of that pastime, and I started sharing some of that stuff on the AMP forum. So there's a community of amp modders and builders and so on. There's a few different forums. A lot of that stuff's kind of moved into Facebook and so on now, but there's still some pretty active kind of old school forums. But when I shared some of the stuff that I was doing there, I realized that a lot of people wanted it. Like, oh, you've done these printed circuit boards for a Marshall, Jose style mod, whatever. Are you selling those? People wanted them. And that's kind of how the first kind of commercial side of what I've grown into started, by actually selling kind of printed circuit boards that people can use as a backbone for their own builds and mods and stuff like that. So yeah, it was just a curiosity that led into an obsession, because once you get some results, what I found is that once I actually modded some of these, amps and started getting tones out of them, that I thought, man, these sound really good, Well, I thought they sounded good. It's addictive. You go again, and then you start searching more and more and more, and then you're like, oh, I want a channel switch in. I'm going to have a clean channel and a gain channel and a lead channel, and then it gets out of control pretty quickly. Yeah.
Are there any kind of, I guess, key periods, Jason, you think that shaped your approach to modding that you can think of, in your kind of development in your career, any key moments or periods?
Yeah, I think that you kind of like, you're constantly, I think you're searching for, I always go back to the tones that my favorite guitar tones ever. And it's, honestly, I do think about whether is my favorite guitar tone, is it the amplifier? Is it the speaker? Is it the speaker cabinet? Is it the way it was mic'd? Clearly it's the guitar player as well, but I always go back to, I kind of gravitated around to a couple of things, right? So Ed Van Halen's guitar tone on the first 5 albums, that old Plexi, down, with the Variac down, the brown sound as everyone knows it as, that guitar tone is like very deep in my brain. And prior to that, though, particularly growing up in this part of the world, the guitar sounds from AC/DC were a massive influence. Probably more Malcolm Young, actually, than Angus. So that really clean and punchy kind of Marshall tone that he had, was a big part of it. So I think that once I started to get some results with what I was doing, your ear becomes more educated, I think. And then I started listening more to some of those tones that I liked, and also doing more research about how those guitar sounds were delivered on the records that we love, And then you get into this whole grey, murky area about, were these amps modded? And if they were, who did them? And when, and what was the mod? And there's whole sections of forums dedicated to this topic, So kind of getting the connection that some of the sounds that I loved weren't necessarily stock amps. That was kind of a light bulb moment of realizing that, I see. So we have, from the original kind of amp companies, and I think I've kind of Fender, Vox, Marshall, I guess Orange or whatever, there's a few others, right? But I always think Marshall and Fender, really. That light bulb moment that most of the, if not all of the modern higher gain sounds, and also some of those older guitar sounds that, that we still loved, weren't necessarily coming from stock amps, and that there was an ability for people to take something and hot rod it or change it. That was probably the biggest, the biggest transformation, or the biggest, step, I guess.
Yeah, I can really understand that. The story was telling you about getting this Marshall when it was young. My brothers bought it because they thought that that's the sound. Getting that amp was going to get that sound, but clearly it wasn't. I mean, so how did you kind of discover? Can you tell us a little bit more about how you kind of discovered that these amps were actually modded? What was the kind of process behind your discovery?
Well, I think that I going back to the the evolution of what Dave Friedman has achieved is how I would describe it. Actually, was very that was a big motivator for me. Like I looked at what he had done and thought, I didn't, I never thought I could replicate it, but I thought, wow, he's actually kind of captured those tones in a range of amplifiers that are very usable. And by usable, I mean you can run them at different volumes and they still sound good. You know what I mean? Like that was realizing that you could get those high gain tones in a kind of a controllable package was I think a big step forward. Sorry, Austin, can you just repeat the question for me again? I lost my train of thought.
Yeah, it was kind of how did you discover that these amps were modded? What was the kind of process? Yeah. What did the research entail?
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. So then, and so I mentioned Dave because what he had done, particularly the Brown Eye, the BE100, that was a kind of the flagship thing, and like that kind of like was the beacon out there, listening to that amp and kind of getting really curious about where that might have come from, and that led me into starting to read all this material I could find, all online. I bought some books, right? There are some amp books. Those books are more about kind of theory as opposed to, telling you that, well, this sound was created by this mod or whatever, But once you start kind of getting into that, it's almost like a whole subculture of modded Marshalls, and you start to discover, because of stuff that is written down based on interviews or something that somebody said in an article, like a guitar player was interviewed by Guitar Player magazine and they said, well, I use this and this and this and this, or a producer, it's on YouTube or something like that and gets asked, so you recorded the, whatever album and what rigs were the guys using or whatever. And you start to build this kind of body of knowledge that makes you realize that those tones were, largely created by this style of mod. There's different styles, like different styles of mods. So you've got you've got the Jose thing, which is kind of probably the most overused term. And when it comes to, Marshall mods, it's a Jose mod. Yeah, okay, which one? It means, I've heard people describe amps as a Jose amp, and I was like,
what does that mean?
All they actually meant was that it had a gain stage added to it. Well, okay, but where? And then you've got and then a lot of people have been hunting the tone that Slash had in the early days of Guns N' Roses, and then you get into that whole story about the SIR 34 and the 36 and the 39 and the Frank Levi modded Marshalls that there's still to this day. It was actually talked about on the live stream I had this morning on my channel with Dave and Dan Gower and Shay, which is Dave said, yeah, no one really knows, We've got a pretty good blueprint, pretty good idea, but no one knows exactly. So it's just kind of once you get into the community and you discover where the good information is, you just got to put the time in, and then you start to connect the dots in your brain about, that style of mod is that kind of sound. That style of mod is this other sound, and this other sound is doing something else, And then you build, as your skills in working with the circuits, working with these amplifiers builds, you start to build a connection between the sound and what part of the circuit is kind of largely responsible for that sound. It's just like when you learn how to play guitar, and you starting, and some of the theory starts to click into place where you understand that, you know, for each major key there's a relative minor, and that if someone's playing these chords, then you can fit them into this key, and then you can improvise over it, and you're going to be pretty safe that you're not going to play notes that are going to sound like you don't know what you're doing. You kind of like, you build, you know, like that starts to become second nature. It takes time, right? But you get that connectivity between the sound and the circuitry. And then you get to we talk again, I think Dan talked a little bit about this morning actually, which was kind of like, you know, he was describing how in his learning curve, he got to the point where he can pretty confidently think of a sound that, you know, tone or an amp that, you know, a circuit that he would like to build, and draw it out on a piece of paper, a schematic, and be 90% there without ever having built it. You know, like then build that thing and it would be 90% of what he was imagining, you know, which is, yeah, it's just where everyone wants to be.
Nice. Thanks, Jason. I mean, that's a general question. You've touched on some of the topics that we're going to get into in the next few questions. The next question is just getting a little bit more specific. Are there any modders, so, you know, people who are modifying amps, or technical innovations that can be whatever you like, technical stuff, that has influenced your approach to modifying Marshalls, and how?
Yeah. I mean, I've mentioned Dave again. You know, I mean, I've already mentioned Dave Friedman a bunch, right, in this chat. But Dave, interestingly, became one of the things I didn't expect when I got into this, because this is a second career for me. You know, I was in IT for 28 years. I was a software developer, turned in project manager, turned into, you know, operations director, and then finished the last 8 years or so in that world running business development, sales and marketing, and product strategy. And then just because I felt I had to, it was time, I left all that behind and went into this full-time. I've been full-time for 2 years. Before that, it was part-time. Everything I did for the Headfirst was in the evenings and in the weekends. But before I went into this full-time, some of these little things started to happen that made me realize that maybe I could be accepted in that world, which is that David reached out to me, and he had seen some of the stuff I'd been posting on my YouTube channel. I'm assuming it's where he kind of found out about me. And he said, you know, looks like you're doing some cool stuff. We should have a call. I was like, all right, Dave, to me, because at that point, Dave Friedman is this kind of legend, you know, and he is a legend. And I was like, wow, that would be amazing. So we just had a video call like this, right? And like chatted for 90 minutes, just like this will be. And he was super friendly, but I realized kind of while it was happening, and when I thought about it afterwards, that he was kind of testing how much I knew, you know, like, is this guy kind of for real, or is he just, you know, is he just faking it kind of thing, right? And I think he realized that I was genuinely passionate about it. And then that connection just went on and on and on. So he has developed into a mentor. You know, we never had an official conversation about, you know, Dave, can you please mentor me or whatever. It's just happened because we just talk a lot. And I've been, you know, made the effort and gone on the plane and gone and visited him, and, you know, spent time and gone out to the bar and gone and had dinner and all that kind of stuff, right? Met his wife, been around to his house, all that kind of stuff. And so he has been a huge influence in terms of understanding the market, why people buy stuff, pricing, business models for selling, you know, i.e. direct versus retail, how you promote stuff in the guitar world online, the importance of YouTubes and influencers and all that kind of stuff. And we talk about circuits, you know, so there's all that kind of like really important kind of business stuff, but when it comes to like, you know, picking up the single person that I've probably learned the most from in terms of approaches to modifying circuits and some practical advice about how to implement it. Definitely Dave. Others as well. So my friend Sho, who I mentioned before, who, you know, is my business partner in the US. You learn from everyone that you have any kind of association with, you know. But it's interesting. The thing about modding, it's a really different approach than designing and building your own amplifier. Okay, when you go about, and, you know, and I've got two products, the Evil Joe and the Alta, and those are ground up designs where I did, you know, all the kind of creating the circuit to deliver the sounds that I wanted and the functionality that I wanted. Did all the printed circuit board design to create it. And when I say printed circuit board, I've actually got one on the ground here. It's this kind of thing, right? That you create in CAD software, you know, printed circuit board design software, and you send those fabrication files out to China. They're all in China. And then you get your circuit boards back delivered on your door by DHL or FedEx or whatever. And then that's the backbone for building amplifiers in the modern world. There are still people doing hand-wired point-to-point or whatever, and that's kind of like, you know, equal part marketing and construction technique, you know, because it's hand-wired, it makes it special. You know, personally, I think hand-wiring is a waste of time. It can make maintenance a little bit easier, 20 years' time maybe, but a printed circuit board design is far superior, I believe, particularly when it comes to designing amplifiers that are relatively high gain and an amplifier that you want to have some features on where you can maybe switch channels and maybe have, you know, some different voicing options that as a guitar player you can activate with a pedal, a foot switch or whatever, that kind of stuff, right? You need to get into printed circuit board design. So when you go down that pathway, it's a whole set of challenges, but they're very unique to that. Back to the modding thing and where the connection with Dave has been very helpful when I was kind of learning the craft, is that it's one thing to come up with a mod in terms of, well, I'm going to change this part of the circuit, right? And I'm going to put, you know, this bypass cap here. I'm going to change this. I'm going to add this extra gain stage or whatever. But then you've got to figure out how to implement it in the confines of an existing design. It's a very different thing than building your own, because you have to work around what you're given, because you're modifying it, not creating it from scratch. And there are little tricks, right, that the old hands have learned through trial and error that you don't necessarily find, and it's not necessarily well documented on the internet anywhere. It's kind of word of mouth stuff, you know. So, yeah, a long answer to your question, but it's hopefully helpful.
Yeah, and as well as Dave, I mean, are there any other influences, even influences you've never met before, or, you know, have you drawn influence from other people's modifications?
Yeah, I mean, you know, so the whole Mike Soldano story, massively, and I guess, to be fair, you know, the stuff that Mike did predates Dave and certainly my awareness way. I can remember playing my first Soldano amp in my 20s, and I couldn't believe it was at a music store. I couldn't afford one. It was an SLO 100, and I could not believe the sound that came out of this thing. It was the first amplifier that I'd ever played that sounded like the stuff that I'd been listening to that morning on a CD or whatever. I was like, man, that's that tone. And it's coming from right there. There's no magic, you know, it's not going through a console with a compressor and God knows what else on it. It's just coming straight out of the speaker. So I didn't know it at the time because I wasn't into modding at all. Like, it was just an amp to me that I just played, right? But I guess when I that really early stage of getting into this, as I said, it was a hobby. The Soldano mod, which now I can see, now I understand how all the stuff's put together. I can see it came from a modded 2203. Right? You can just see it. And you can see where everything comes from something. You know? So yeah, Mike, definitely. I mean, there's, Reinhold Bogner, definitely. I personally am not a fan of the Bogner sound. And I don't mind saying that. I mean, it's, as I said before, it's a very subjective thing. To me, it's too dark, too polished in the top end, and it kind of rolled off. Like there's too much kind of low pass filtering going on in there. For me, I like the Marshall's true Marshall tone has got more aggression and bite in the upper mid range and top end. However, what Reinhold has done with the Bogner brand, the company, maintaining his independence, just amazing. And his engineering brain and engineering skills, having now had the the opportunity to work on a range of his amps, the Ecstasy, Überschall, the Helios, all kinds of things. Constantly impressed with the genius of that guy, of how he's actually designed this stuff from an engineering perspective. He's crazy scientist guy, but makes it a reality, makes kind of stuff actually work in production, kind of production proof. I'd say John Suhr as well, another name in the industry that I have huge amount of respect for, and for a lot of the same reasons why I mentioned for Bogner as well, which is built this thing from the ground up, maintained it as a family-run company, just done the whole thing the old-fashioned way, and has this great successful business run out of California when he's delivering guitars and amplifiers worldwide, and also is a guy that certainly in terms of his higher gain range of amplifiers, have all come from Marshall DNA. So that's another thing which I really like. I mean, I have respect for that, right? Because those are the sounds that I like. Whether it's a modified Plexi or a modified 2203, in the Marshall world, that's all there is. You mentioned modified Jubilee, so I do want to talk about that because that's quite rare. There is some modified Jubilee stuff out there, mostly in the Wizard amps. Have you guys heard of Wizard?
Yep.
Yeah. So a lot of that stuff you can trace back to kind of Jubilee DNA. And I would, now that I've mentioned it, the Wizard stuff was that was another area that I became those amplifiers and why they sounded like they did, which I thought sound amazing. That was a big motivator for me too in my early stages of like wanting to understand how are those sounds being generated? Like, what is that? Because every time I heard a Wizard, I went, man, those things sound amazing.
Just this wasn't my next question. I've got another question I'm going to hand over to Dan, but before I forget it, I'll ask this question now, Jason. Can you explain to us what you think the kind of the lineage, the kind of trajectory, the development is of high gain amplifiers? A kind of assuming that we start with a Plexi. How do we get to where we are now?
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. I'll do it. Yeah. Okay. I can kind of like this. I think there's some markers, definitely some milestones that happened there, and you can. Yeah, okay. I'm not thinking about how to order that in my brain, but yeah, definitely. Okay, so we start with the Plexi, a 1959 Super Lead. We all know what that amp can do, and we all know that it sounds amazing, but you got to turn it all the way up. And then at that point, it's, you can't be in the same room with the thing, So Marshall obviously, responded to that not a complaint, but it was a usability issue, shall we call it, created the master volume JMP. So one of my little pet hates, but I've just grown to live with it, is that in the Marshall world, people use the term JMP and 800 to describe an amplifier when it's a series, more than one amplifier in the JMP range, and 800s, that does my head in, right? Because there's like 12. Sounds like an 800. Oh, which one? Like, come on, man. But anyway, I've just grown to live with it. And now I do it myself because I just realize it's just easier to go with the flow. But anyway, so the JMP master volume, 2203, 2204. And for a minute there, actually what they did was they just Marshall had the Plexi front end, which is a parallel gain stage, right? So the first valve or tube, which we call V1, in high gain amplifiers, you typically would cascade gain stages. Okay, so your guitar input comes into one, it gets amplified, the output of that then hits the input of the next stage, and then you drive the valve into clipping, and that's that overdrive that we love. In the Plexi, because of the way the high treble and the normal channel set up, they're actually in parallel. They don't cascade into one another. They mix together by the time it gets to the EQ, treble, middle, bass controls. So that's why it's a very low gain preamp, because we're not really kind of cascading gain stages there, which is why you need to turn the bloody things up for them to distort. So when Marshall, for a minute there, when they first introduced the master volume amps, they kept the same front end and just put a master volume on it. And everyone went, no, because the amp was clean. When you turn it down at a usable volume, it's quite clean. It's just a crunchy amp, right? That mod is still quite common. I will actually often get super leads in here that have had a master volume added, and it's that style. And, it's like kind of useful, but it makes the amp very low gain. Quite quickly, they responded to that complaint and created the 2203 and the 2204 as we know them today, which is where they actually took those. So each preamp valve has two gain stages in it, right? Two triodes. Mm-hmm. And they cascaded the output of one into the input of the next. And so then we had a cascaded preamp, which is really the architecture for high gain amplifiers today, right? So that was the first big milestone on the road, right? Wow, we've got an amplifier that's generating overdrive in the preamp rather than in the power amp. Right, so that was a big thing. I think you'd probably then go all the way through to, I would go through to kind of what was starting to happen in, I guess, the music scene and what was happening in California and in the 80s. And, I mentioned before about the Jose mod, right? And what he figured out, and I think it was then, him and I guess Lee Jackson was probably another guy around at the time that was doing similar things, but I much prefer that kind of Jose sound. And he figured out a couple of things that, again, are building blocks for high gain amplifiers today, which is cascading gain stages, but kind of pushing them much harder. So when you set up, and this is part of the design process, which you go through when you're designing an amp or modding, you can decide as a designer how much gain you want from a gain stage, and also the characteristics of the gain stage, whether it's going to clip symmetrically or asymmetrically. So you can kind of have the waveform clip just on one side. Some people might hear the term cold clipper when people refer to a 2203 or a 2204. That's a coldly biased gain stage that has asymmetric clipping properties, and it has a certain tonality about it. That's that when you play a 2203 and you hear that kind of almost a bit rumbly kind of sound, different sound than a Plexi. that part of the circuit is a big contributor to that. Anyway, so Jose figured out, I think, well, he maybe wasn't the first one to do it, but it's certainly a characteristic of his mods, that when you cascade that stuff, you could actually push the gain characteristics of those triodes much hotter, so that you're developing a lot more overdrive more quickly. And the second thing that he did, which was, I certainly believe he was the first one to do this, and it's been copied by everybody, including me, diode clipping in the amp, right? And so, the main Jose mod, we talked before about, what Jose mod, well, which one, that you put it broadly into no diodes and diodes. The diode clipping mod had the extra gain stage. The non-diode clipping mod just had the extra gain stage that Jose added. By extra gain stage, I mean he would drill a hole in the chassis and put a whole new preamp tube in it, and wire that in. But the diode clipping thing is a real genius kind of approach. And what he basically did was to simulate the compression. So we talked before about how when you push a valve into overdrive, the waveform, which is your audio signal, gets squared off. It goes into clipping, where the valve goes into shut off basically, because it's reached its upper limit. He figured out that if you use Zener diodes, a Zener diode has a defined voltage upon which, when you reverse bias it, it clamps the voltage. So you can imagine when you play and you have an audio signal, right? It's got a voltage. At that part of the amplifier, the voltage swing can be 100 volts from top to bottom. He figured out that by putting diodes in there that clamp that and square it off, you could generate a sound that was really similar and characteristic to a Plexi when you put it on 10. Because what happens when you put a super lead on 10 is that the valves are doing that. Because by the time it gets to the phase inverter, which is kind of where this mod would be, which is kind of pre-phase inverter, you could simulate that sound, but at any volume. And it's a feel thing as well, right? Because as a guitar player, and you guys are both guitar players, you'll know what I mean by this, is that when an amp gets into that level of compression and saturation, because it's cranked, it gets softer to play. It's easier to play, notwithstanding the volume. Let's just imagine the volume. You're not having to confront that, but the amp's sagging, because every time you hit a note, the power tubes particularly are pulling massive current from the reservoirs, the filter caps and the power transformer. And what actually happens is the supply voltages in the amp, they sag down. And as a guitar player, what you experience is this little bit of sponginess. Is when you first hit the note, it's not quite as confronting, and it's more playable. It's easier to play. This is one of the reasons I think why Ed Van Halen used the Variac, because he figured out that if I turn the voltage down, the amp's softer. It's easier to play. You try it. It's way easier to play. You get a super lead at 240 volts and you dial it down to 180, 170, somewhere around there. The change in the feel of the amp is so noticeable. So with the diode clipping, that's what he figured out. And that's kind of a genius thing that is in a lot of modern amplifiers today still. That same technique, right? Then I think that the other big one I would mention, I think that is again quite unique in its characteristic, and has became a building block which has been repeated in a lot of amplifiers, and probably the biggest selling amplifier of all time, the dual rectifier, was Mike Soldano's approach. And I mentioned before that I can look at the SLO 100 and see that its kind of DNA comes from a 2203. And he added an extra gain stage into that circuit, but not at the front. What Jose was doing was kind of putting that extra gain stage out as the very first thing that your guitar signal would hit, and then just push it into the rest of the amp. He kind of came up with this thing where he put this gain stage kind of towards the end of the preamp, and developed I've heard him talk about this on Tone Talk with Dave Friedman again. You know, like I've watched all of those ones where they've had the amp designers on, because they talk about stuff and it's like super, you know, you learn stuff, right? And he talked about how he created that sound. It's a Soldano sound. It's quite a signature thing. And I mentioned before about a cold clipper gain stage. Well, he kind of created his own version of that, and he says on this live stream that he got it up on the oscilloscope and just played with values until he saw a waveform that he thought that he needed, and then he played it and he went, "Oh wow, that's it. It's the sound that I want." He uses a particular value of resistor in the cathode. It's a 39K resistor. It's a very unusual thing to use that value. Like most gain stages are set up with a cathode no greater than 10K. When say 10K, say 10,000 ohms. He's a 39K, right? And it's kind of like, why would you do that? Now, that little signature, thing has been replicated, copied, and then, so as a big milestone in that whole journey, and then it made its way into the dual rectifier and the 5150, the original, the OG PV5150, almost a direct copy of the SLO 100, as is the dual rectifier. And then over time, those things are kind of like, they start to take on their own little evolutionary path. But you can see there's like, boom, big marker in the ground, Mike Soldano, and then a whole lot of stuff that then came, was generated off the back of that. There's the whole kind of Mesa Boogie story around the Mark series amps and so on, which are, modified Fender circuits. But yeah, that's a whole stream of high gain development that I just purposely decided to kind of just push to the side. Not that I don't like it, but it's not really the tones that, that I'm passionate about.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that. Jason, sorry, just very briefly to pick up on that. So Mesa were kind of Fender DNA. Yeah. And then at that time when Soldano came out, do you think that they shifted over to that style for the dual rectifier, and then the kind of subsequent amps coming out after that, do you think they kind of changed their approach?
Oh, I think they just added to their approach. So I think the Mark series kind of continued on its way, and those things have a very particular sound. Have either of you owned or played a Mark series amp?
Played a few,
yeah. They're a weird thing, like they really. I mean, I've got a Mark III, no stripe, a relatively recent edition. It's not something that's, again, it's because it wasn't an amp or a kind of style of tone that I was massively into. I mean, like we all know the Metallica story and all the rest of it, and they're great guitar tones, make no mistake, but it's just not a thing that I was massively into. But I did get one just because I just wanted to have that reference, like I could go back to it and go, oh yeah, that's what that thing is, That's really difficult to dial in, because it's not a architecture I'm very used to. And then you got that big graphic EQ at the back. I say the back because it's at the back of the preamp, last thing, the preamp, which is a huge kind of a massive filter. If everyone's played one of those amps and you turn the EQ off and turn it back on again, and you turn the EQ off, it sounds like a transistor radio. It's just all boxy mid-range, and it just sounds like, oh my God, it's the worst sounding amp ever. And then you put the EQ on and you go, wow, it's amazing. Which kind of, it's not an approach that motivates me, because it's like, why do you have to put that thing at the end? It should just sound good. By the time it gets there, it should sound good already, like, what are you doing that for? Anyway, so I think they carried on their merry way with the Mark series stuff. And then I think, look, who knows? And I know So Randall Smith has started his own podcast where he's talking about the evolution and the history of Mesa Boogie. But I just think they saw, my feeling on all this is that they saw an opportunity with this whole kind of modern Marshall style genre and what was happening in that, like, you know, Mike Soldano couldn't make SLO 100s fast enough. You know, they were just getting picked up. Once it was particularly some big players started ordering them, you know, and everyone from Stevie Ray Vaughan, you know, to Ed Van Halen and many others were starting to use these amplifiers, and I think they saw an opportunity and took it.
Cool. Can you describe maybe one specific modification you've made to a Marshall and its effect on the tone compared to the original signal? Is there anything you can think about a specific mod that you've done?
Yeah. Mostly the most common request that I get, and I'm sure it's very anyone who mods Marshalls, they get very much the same theme. And the theme is, I want the high gain sound that this amp should be capable of, but with a volume control, please. That is the most common thing. And then it's just a question of where on the gain spectrum are you? You know, so I always ask people, so I have some mods that I can just replicate, you know, and I'll say, well, I'll just, you know, we'll do this mod, you know. But more often than not, I will say, okay, talk to me about your favorite guitar tones, like bands, CDs, records, you know, whatever, guitar players, you know, and you can get a pretty quick read on where they are on the spectrum, right? If someone says, you know, Gary Holt from Exodus, then you kind of go, okay, I know where they're going, you know. And if someone else says, you know, Slash, whatever, you know where that is, right? So you have this kind of, you end up with this little library, I guess, of, you know, little things that you can draw on to implement that. So more often than not, it's some variation on adding extra gain. Normally an extra gain stage is actually how you do that, or you take what's there and get more out of it, you know. So if they're only looking for a bit more, you can generate quite a lot of extra gain just by changing the characteristics of the gain stages that are already in the amp. If they're looking for, you know, thrash metal kind of end of the spectrum, you need to actually add, more often than not, you'll need to add another tube in. So because you need an extra stage or two to actually generate that thing. And then there's the old question of master volumes. With that style of mod, particularly if you're working with a super lead style architecture, which doesn't have a master volume, you will always be adding a master volume. And again, there's different types of masters. You know, I mean, there's three main ones. You have like a master volume with clipping diodes, which is the Jose thing. You have a master volume, which you would see on a 2203 JMP or a JCM 800 2203, which is a post-tone stack, pretty traditional master. And then you have probably the most common master volume, which is made, mod, which is made to a stock super lead, which is a post-phase inverter master volume. You'll often see it abbreviated as PPIMV. You go onto the gear page or any of these things and you'll see people talk about PPIMVs, post-phase inverter master volume. And again, that's a whole, you know, whole separate way of doing it. And then you don't mix and match things. So like if you put a whole lot of high gain, if you generate a lot more gain in the preamp, it will narrow down what you will do for a master volume. So some of them are not necessarily complementary.
So if you can, maybe if you can think of, you know, some mods you've done apart from adding more gain, is there anything else that's done to the sound of the amp? Has it changed it in any way?
Yeah, look, so making making a single channel amplifier a multi-channel amp is kind of like, when you mention that question, I'm going to go straight to that, because that's pretty common, and you need to be wary of where to draw the line on that. So, like, through trial and error mainly, I've figured out where it is that I say no to these requests, because you do get crazy requests. You get requests like from guys that have just dreamt up this, wild dream amp, and then they send you an email and say, can you do this, and you get to the point where I would just say, just buy my altar, because that's what that does. I do.
Yeah.
Like, that's why I designed it, because I wanted to do all those things that you've just asked for. But you do. It's very common to get, back in the Marshall world, right, where you've got a gainy amp. Someone needs a clean channel. I need a clean channel in this thing, Can you put a clean channel in? Can you do something with the gain channel? Maybe make it a bit hotter, But I really need a clean channel in this amp, and it needs to be foot switchable. So that's kind of the next most common thing. So.
Cool. Over to you, Dan. Question 4.
Yeah, keeping it obviously in the Marshall territory, how does circuit design of Marshall amps enable or complicate your modifications compared to other amplifiers you've worked on, or other amplifier brands?
I think for me now, the Marshall circuit design it's kind of the home base, right? So I always think of the starting point as, the 1959 Super Lead. Plexi, or a 2203 starting point. Those are kind of your two main. And even then, those two, you can turn one into the other by changing 5 things, something like that. Not many, handful. And that's another mod that I have done many times. Right, someone's got a Super Lead and they say, "Can you turn this into just a 2-input 2203?" Yeah, no worries. Right. Really, they use the same printed circuit board and everything. So the circuit design from a Marshall perspective is kind of home base. It's more about when you move into some of the different construction methods that we used, that's when it becomes more tricky, because you're then into that the practical side of implementing the mod. It's one thing to say, well, I know what I need to change. I've mentioned this before, right? I know what I need to change. I'm going to change this resistor to that value. I'm going to put that bypass cap in there. I'm going to change that coupling cap, and I'm going to, I don't know, a bunch of stuff. Then you have to do it. And then when you're presented with an SV20, which is a Plexi, it's a very stock Plexi front end, different power amp, as we know. It's a 20-watt. Cathode bias EL34 power amp, which those tubes are capable, if they're configured how they're meant to run, are capable of delivering 50 watts. But the preamp all the way through, including the phase inverter and the negative feedback circuit and everything, is pretty much a stock 1959 Super Lead. But when you open up one of those amps, you see that the whole thing, including all of the sockets on the rear of the amp and all of the pots on the front, are all PCB mounted. Right? Whereas most of the 2203, 2204s or Super Leads that you will get to modify will have chassis mount pots. They'll have printed circuit boards in them, because Marshall used printed circuit boards from 1974. And have ever since, in all those amps. Until now, they've got a 1959 hand-wired reissue, which is back to using a turret board. But all of those Marshall amps from the early 70s right up to now, even the reissues, right, the 2203X, 987X, the 50-watt Plexi, they all use what Marshall called the ST1 printed circuit board. But so you know what you're going to get. You know that, in terms of the kind of the barriers or whatever, like it's that understanding of like what your starting point is in terms of physical form rather than the schematic. Schematic's kind of easy. It's like, okay, you got to be practical about how I go about doing this, so that you create a mod that's not going to fall over in 3 months' time. Because the reality of this stuff is that that amplifier head will be placed on top of, more often than not, a 4x12, and they will, particularly if someone's gigging with it, and they'll crank it, and it's going to go and vibrate like hell for the rest of its life. So you need to think about the practical side of it as well.
I mean, are there any specific features of Marshall's circuit design that make modding easier or harder? I mean, how do these features compare to other amps or influence the types of mods you pursue?
I think that, for me, that super lead and the 2203 starting point, that's easy now, because I've just done so many of them. And it's like, even in my own stuff, my own amplifiers, I've never tried to say that these are creations that I've dreamt up from scratch, and of course they're not. They come from something. There's a family lineage, like a DNA, and those things, not surprisingly, have come from those. There's building blocks there, right, from those old Marshall circuits. But once you get into the more difficult stuff, right, I'm going to now talk a bit about maybe like the Jubilee.
Yep.
DSL.
Mm-hmm.
And the JCM 2000, right?
Well, the JVM,
which is the
JVM,
like the TSL. I have modded, and I've looked at and understood and modded a DSL. Just because it was, it was like, oh yeah, I should just do that next, and I did it. I did it for a guy. I did it, and I remember having kind of like, it was one of those ones where you're doing it for the first time, so there's quite a lot of R&D that goes into figuring out. You got to have ideas immediately about what you need to change, because what I do is like, you play through the amp stock and you get a feel for it, right? You're like, how do these controls interact, and what does it sound like? My impression with the DSL. So this was a DSL 100, one of the Vietnamese made ones, like the kind of recent one. I thought that the green, I think we call it the green channel, or channel 1, which has the 2 modes, sounded pretty much okay, actually. I thought it sounded kind of like what I expected. And I thought the high gain channel sounded just terrible. Just super bassy and undefined, and nothing like what I had hoped they would. And so you immediately start to have ideas when I'm looking at the schematic and I'm playing it. And I'm looking at kind of the signal flow and playing the amp at the same time, and getting like, this is why it sounds like this, And so you start getting ideas straight away, but then you've actually got to implement it and then play it. And it's an iterative thing. It's a pain in the ass, because that whole amplifier's kind of not laid out amazingly well. It's the PCBs that they were using are quite fragile. So you can kind of end up inadvertently kind of, smoking a solder trace off the printed circuit board, if you're not careful, and kind of like, and it becomes a very kind of tricky endeavor. So beyond the DSL, I have just not gone anywhere near it. People contact me with like JVMs.
Yep.
Can you mod a JVM? No. All right. I played around with the Origin just because they're so affordable, and I actually open sourced and published videos on a bunch of Origin mods that I just kind of felt like the right thing to do. It felt like a good thing to kind of like just share all that stuff, and I also knew that when I did it, that it would help create some profile, and ultimately when I'm sharing that stuff, I'm trying to build an audience on YouTube that I can sell my own stuff to. Like I've always said that. There's always a means to the end. But in terms of their kind of flagship stuff, like nothing beyond the DSL. Now the Jubilee is really interesting. I have not modded a Jubilee, but I have built amps that are based on modded Jubilees, because I went through a little phase in my learning curve where, as I mentioned before, I got super curious about about the Wizard sound,
Mhm.
and I built from scratch. I built that circuit. I built an MC2 and an MTL because I wanted to understand what they sounded like and kind of what made them tick. And that was realizing, going through all that, I realized where, as I said before, everything comes from something. I could see where those came from. My friend Shay at Monomyth, he has modded a handful of Jubilees, and they sound pretty ripping, like very high gain. He's very high gain kind of style of what he delivers. But yeah, like the Jubilee is it's interesting because it's like it is such a different design than what preceded it. I can look at all of the evolution of Super Lead, to the JMP, the 800s and the very different variations in there, the 2205, which is kind of different again. And I could see the evolution from the 2203, 2204, which is pretty much the same amp, just 50 and 100. 2205, very different. And there's a few variations on that. Then into the 900s, you can see the evolution. The Marshall Jubilee was like, what? Where did that come from? It's so different.
Can you elaborate on any specific differences?
Okay, well, the main thing is that it has a plate-driven tone stack. Mm-hmm. So have you ever heard this term before, cathode follower or plate-fed? Is that a term that's...
This is going beyond my expertise, yeah.
Okay. It's a circuit design choice in terms of... so the EQ, right, treble middle bass on all these amps, they're passive networks.
Yep.
So it's not an active EQ where you have op amps and so on and that you're actually boosting frequencies. All they're doing is taking frequencies away.
Yep.
And they're all wired together actually. So the treble middle bass network is all one ecosystem, which is kind of why sometimes if you set your bass pod in a certain position, the response that you get from the mid and the treble is different than if you have the bass somewhere else. They'll work together. So there's a part of the amplifier that just precedes that has to drive the signal. It's responsible for kind of driving your audio signal, which is in electronic form, into that network and out the other side, and not having too much signal loss. Because if you drive an electrical signal through a passive resistive network, you'll get signal drop off and degradation, right? So there's a part of the amplifier that was designed to do that in a way. It's called a cathode follower, which creates a signal that is sufficiently strong to push through that network without much signal loss. It has a certain tonal characteristic though as well. And the Marshall amps that we all love from the 60s and the 70s and the 80s they all used that particular style to drive the EQ, a cathode follower. Okay, it's a big part of the signature sound, I think, of those amps, right? And then the Jubilee came along, and it's plate fed, which is just think of that as a completely different way of doing it. That has it's a very different signature sound. And as a guitar player, what you would normally observe with a plate-driven EQ is that the EQ is really responsive. It's almost like it's active. It's not, it's still passive, but it feels really like, wow, like you bump the mids and it gets really honky really quickly. And you back the mids off and it scoops out massively. And the treble pot will be, and this is what the Jubilee's like, right? The treble pot, it's kind of super dark, and then you get to midday and it's like, oh, that's really nice. And you bring it up and it goes, whoa, it just gets really bright real quick. So it's a very different feel. And it's, so this is why, like, it just, for me, now that I understand what that stuff is, I just look at it and go, man, I don't actually know kind of like how the connection happened, but it's a very, very different approach. And it still has that sort of Marshall signature sound, which they worked on to deliver. But the way it goes about it is completely different, which is kind of why, like, if you think about the modded Marshall, what's happened in the evolution of modded Marshalls, when I look at all that, I don't know what the percentages are, but is it 90, 95% or something? It's all based on 2203s and Super Lees and variations of.
Yeah.
Not a lot out there in the modded Jubilee world, It's just like if you called up Dan Gower, Dave Friedman, I don't know, let's list a whole bunch of people doing Marshall mods, right? Yeah, I've got a Jubilee. What are they going to say? They'll probably say, "Oh yeah." So if you got a JCM 800, well, I'd rather work on that. It's just a different animal. Yeah.
Well, I'll actually like flipping onto that because it's kind of, I think you've touched a little bit on this already, but how have guitarist demands for specific tones or performance needs shaped your approach to modifying Marshall amps?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that the whole modding thing, it pushes you to do things that you wouldn't necessarily do of your own accord, which is really important. Like you need that, like set kind of like. I think the reason that a lot of us still do mods, even though we have our own amplifiers, is because you end up discovering new things, and you create often by happy accident, and you're like, wow, that I didn't realize if I did that, it would necessarily generate that result. And then I document that, that thing might end up becoming a core part of an amp that I might release in the future as a Headfirst amp, because it was kind of like I stumbled upon it or I developed it over time through modding. And the modding came from, back to the question about the customer, is like, I think you need to leave the window open a little bit to have them tell you what they want, because it's very easy to have, once you develop a kind of a library, like a set of, you might have 3, 4, 6, whatever standard kind of things that you do. Very easy to just get into the routine and just put that up on your website or whatever, or on an email that you send to someone. These are the 6 things I can do. This costs A, this costs B, this costs C, this costs D. Tick which one you want, because then you're just cranking the handle. Like you've already figured out, you've done the R&D on each of those mods. You know how to implement them. It's much easier to actually make some money doing that, because you're not wasting time trying to figure out how to do stuff. But after a while, that's kind of like, it doesn't lead anywhere. It's just kind of like all of a sudden you find yourself, well, I'm just like a mechanic. I'm just kind of just doing this thing, and not that much, doesn't become much fun after a while. So you got to leave the window open, I think, to like having the customer push you and tell you what, and let them tell you what they want. And then it's just, as I said before, it's just a question of like knowing when to say no. It's like, yeah, I'll do all those things, but I'm not doing that. Like if you want that, you need to go and buy a different amp, because I'll be here for 3 weeks trying to do it, kind of thing.
Right. So do those customers' demands, have they evolved over time, or are they sort of echoing trends from specific periods?
Yeah, look, I think they have for me, and they have in terms of what people have asked me for. And there's no doubt that as I've got more into this, I've dabbled in, not dabbled, but I've definitely broadened the spectrum of what I will do into more higher gain stuff. Because I grew up learning guitar and playing guitar, and in the 80s basically. By the time 1991 came around, I was 21 years old. So the whole the dual rectifier thing, we talked about dual rectifiers before, right? And how much music in the 90s was recorded with dual rectifiers. I like a lot of that music, but I never owned a dual rectifier. it was like, it wasn't that interesting to me. I was still like, listening to all the stuff that was produced in the mid to late 80s. And I did get into all that 90s stuff, but in terms of the guitar tones, they never really made me think they were amazing guitar sounds. I was more into the songs of the 90s rather than the guitar tones.
Mm-hmm.
So back to your question, I think that as I've kind of gone through my own evolution of, I guess you build confidence, right? You build confidence in realizing that you can produce a result. Producing higher gain amplifiers or higher gain mods becomes tricky. It's actually hard. A lower gain mod is easy because you can get away with a lot more. And by hard, I mean, so it doesn't squeal, doesn't oscillate, it doesn't have a terrible noise floor. So when you turn the gain up, the amp's just going, you know what I mean? Like,
yep.
you gotta the ultimate thing, right, is to have the amp so quiet and so controllable that, like, is it on? Is it even on? And then you play and it's like, oh yeah, fuck, it's on, all right. In a high gain design, particularly when you're modding something and you don't have, back to my printed circuit board, one of the things we do on here, and you can see it, this conveniently purple, you can kind of see, you see all this copper here? There's no copper here, but over here there's all this big,
right.
There's tracks here, but there's also big copper. They call it a pore. It's like pouring copper on there. It's a shield.
Yep.
Noise shield. Like, you think of your guitar cable, right? It has the signal running through the middle of it. On the outside of the cable is the shield, which is ground. It's like that because it prevents electromagnetic interference getting into your signal. Have you ever tried to play guitar with a non-shielded cable, just like two wires, plug it into your amp? It sound terrible, right? Because it'll be noisy. The same thinking has to go through your whole amp. So, so that kind of evolution for me was like getting more confident to kind of like higher gain, even higher, And then when people start hearing some of the stuff that you're doing, they go, oh, he's doing some of this high gain stuff now, right? And then you get then the requests come in and people want more and more, can you make it more, like it's almost like an arms race. I talk about some of the high gain stuff, right? Like, there's guitar players out there. It's not my style. It's not kind of how I play. I mean, I like gain, don't get me wrong, right? But I don't like it off, uncontrollable. But there are guitar players out there who speak with me. No amount of gain is enough. Like, at that point, honestly, it doesn't even sound like a guitar to me anymore. That sound, that really modern kind of metal thing. It's heavily gated.
Yep.
Like really hard noise gate.
Got to get your attack somewhere.
It's just like, it's binary at that point, right? Like, it's either on or off. It's like,
It's called, is that the gent stuff you're talking about?
Yeah,
yeah.
All
that stuff, yeah.
Yeah, all that stuff, right? So, that's like, I know that stuff's been around for ages, but for me, it's been, it was a whole kind of genre and a sound that I hadn't really paid that much attention to. But I have more recently. Been interesting, actually, because like listening to those guitar sounds and kind of figuring out like the band Meshuggah. I was aware of who they were. Never listened to them because I couldn't get past the screamy vocals. Every time I put a Meshuggah song on, I'm like, oh my God, how do people listen to this, It's like, but now, freaking, I really like them because I wanted to understand, they're using Mike Fortin modded amps. So Fortin's another legend out there, right? And I haven't even mentioned his name the whole time here, but he's a guy that has created a whole business. Really kind of the DNA for his stuff is the Jose, diode clipping Jose, which I talked about, the clamping diodes and all that, back from the 80s. He's taken that and kind of pushed it into a whole new modern direction. And I got into Meshuggah because I was interested in like, well, I know that they're using his amps. What is that sound? And, you listen to it enough and you realize that these guys are like, it's actually really, I really like the music. It's genius music. So I don't know, man. It's like the customer stuff pushes you into new tones because they're listening to stuff that I'm not necessarily listening to.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Kind of leads me onto a really interesting thought as well of what specific guitar playing techniques have you observed guitarists using or developing due to tones produced by modified Marshall amps?
Ooh. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean,
you kind of touched on it with the gent stuff and the.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of like in the modern era. That's definitely, you know, that's definitely a thing. And I think, I don't know what came first, right? The high gain or the noise gate. Maybe the high gain came first and the noise gate followed it because it was completely necessary. Because as soon as I stopped playing, the amps are too, you know, they're just noisy, right? Or they squeal, you know, like because. One of the things that I will say about that, and this is something about the modeler generation. I don't know what we call it, right? But the generation of players that are coming through that have never played Marshalls, real amps, whatever. And this goes back to your question about the technique, right? Volume control on the guitar is, and I think a loud Marshall, particularly a loud Marshall super lead style amp, where it's really cranked, and so they're quite. I mean, a super lead cranked up is a pretty high gain, right? Like a lot of people think of Plexi as like, oh, you know, not that high gain. Man, those things when they're dimed, they have a lot of gain. But also super dynamic. So the range of sounds that you get from a single channel amp like that, in terms of technique, comes from understanding how to use your volume.
Mm-hmm.
Your volume is your noise gate. And you want to play the loud amp, you stop playing. The only thing you can do, stop it from feeding back and squealing or whatever. It's like you roll, and it becomes instinct. It's an instinct. Like you can tell. I can always tell a guitar player who's played amps and gigged a lot because when they stop playing, it's automatic. The volume's on zero. You didn't even see it happen. And but I've seen other guys who haven't necessarily had the same kind of live experience or whatever. They can be good guitar players, and they stop playing, and all you hear is because it's like, turn the freaking volume down. You know, like they just haven't. It's not a technique that's been developed, right? So I'm kind of connecting the technique thing back to the amp, you know, because like I'm a big believer that the electric guitar as an instrument is the guitar and the amp.
Mm-hmm.
The electric guitar by itself is just a bit of wood with some strings on it. It doesn't make any noise. There's no tone. Like it just doesn't make any sound. You know, it needs to be plugged into an amp. And now you've got an instrument, right? And it's like, oh, that's an ecosystem. It's actually those things work together. You know, and I think that I remember like one of the things that, you know, I mentioned I started learning bass guitar. And the bass guitar is a great instrument. And in some ways, I wish I'd really continued to practice it. I still do play, you know, from time to time. But what attracted me to guitar, I can kind of remember, right, starting to see maybe a few music videos or listening to guitar-orientated rock that my eldest brother was bringing into the house. Judas Priest, Van Halen, Kiss, AC/DC, I don't know, the list goes on and on. Older stuff as well. And I started to hear things that I just thought, it's feedback, pick scrapes. You know, the sound of like, you know what I mean, right? And I think that now in relation to your question, I'm thinking like, how did that stuff come about? And to me, it came about because of those amplifiers that as their techniques evolved and the kind of amplifiers that Marshall was starting to put out there, because you can see that the evolution of where they came from with the JTM 45 into the kind of transitional JMP 50, then into the super leads, and then into the 2203s, 2204s that we've talked about, was in response to guitar players saying, I want punchier, louder, and I want more gain. You know,
Yeah.
then they delivered those things, and then the great players that knew how to harness that, were having that come into their techniques and getting that, because once you have an amp like that and it's cranked up like that and you're playing it, it's a living thing then. Anyone who's experienced playing a loud amp like that, where your guitar pickup is interacting with the speaker, there's that 360-degree feedback thing that happens, you know what I mean? I can just see that, the amplifier influenced what they were doing massively.
Moving specifically into modifications, though, are there any techniques linked to particular modifications or tonal qualities you worked on?
From a guitar player's technique, I don't think so. I can't really think of a guitar technique that comes to mind that happened because of a mod. I think mods have given. There's definitely a connection between mods and a particular tonality. Like a sound.
Well, what about that? Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean the Jose thing. So when I think about the guitar sounds of the hair metal bands, in the day, right? A lot of those sounds were delivered through Jose modded Marshalls, or people that were, had figured out what Jose was doing and were kind of doing a similar thing. So you can hear it, those guitar sounds that you hear on, the early Rat records or whatever, right? It's that tone. And so is there a connection between a mod and a genre and the sound of a genre of music? Yeah, probably. And I think also the Mike Soldano mod, which I mentioned before, the 39K resistor and all that rubbish, which then was the genesis for the creation of the dual rectifier. Is there a connection between the sound of the dual rectifier and the music, the rock music in the 90s and how that sounds? Yeah, I think so.
You were talking earlier about something super interesting, which was the feedback loop between the entire ecosystem of the guitar. Is there something about the instantaneous nature of that feedback that changes things?
Yeah, I think so. This is the dilemma. I think the dilemma for a guitar player in the modern day is the silent stage. In their monitors, no cabs on stage and all that, right? Now, I've done this, I mean, up until about 2 years ago or whatever, I had never done that. I was always like, every time I played in a band, it was amp cab, loud enough that, you're up with the drummer, you got a drummer banging away on a kit. It's loud, pretty loud, so you got to get your amp up to be balanced with that. And that's the experience that I knew and loved. And then I found myself playing in a band with an old friend of mine, and he's like, trying to get me to join the band or whatever. And he said, "Oh, I've got to tell you one thing." And I said, "What's that?" And he goes, "Everyone's on in-ears." And I was like, "Oh, okay." I said, "Well, okay, but what does that mean?" And he said, "Well, no one's using amps." I'm like, "What? What do you mean no one's using amps?" Of course I know. I mean, I've got a quad cortex and a freaking X effects, and I got all these. I know I know how they work, right? I can use them. But then I actually had to try it and go through that experience myself. And man, what that feedback loop, what a huge difference. I actually had to adapt my rig because I couldn't handle it. I couldn't like it. I could live with it if I had to, but for me, having some interaction with a real amplifier going through a real speaker cabinet and coming back in through your guitar, it doesn't need to actually be that loud, but you need to have some, because it changes your playing experience, I believe, And that actually changes how you play. You know, like, you guys are guitar players, right? You musicians, you know that how comfortable you are with your instrument and how it's feeling. Is this a difficult thing, or is this an easy thing? Am I getting inspired by this sound, or does it sound terrible and all I'm doing is hating it the whole time? That has a huge influence on your performance, I think. So yeah, I think it's a massive part of all that, right? And I think that I don't know where this leads to, because, you know, so many pro players that I know here in Melbourne, who, you know, guys that are actually playing guitar for a living, are faced with this problem every day. And that's their, you know, when they talk to me about kind of the things that they want, because they talk to me about product development, you know, are you bringing this out, Jason? What about this preamp thing that you keep talking about? When's that going to come out? Blah, 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 you know, because they're looking for solutions that will tick both boxes. Give them the experience that they're playing through an amp and getting that kind of feedback thing happening, but keeping the musical director and the production staff happy and the singer happy, or whatever situation that they're in, where they don't have to have an amp blaring on stage, you know?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think that's it for those questions of mine. I think I might hand back across to Austin.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Dan. Yeah, Jason, you've touched a little bit on this kind of sense of community and so on. We're going to have a couple of little questions around that. How have your interactions with other technicians or guitar players, you know, such as sharing ideas, exchange of ideas, and so on, how do you think that shaped your work, but also your perception of, like, there being a sense of community?
Austin, I've been surprised at how open people have been. It's one of the things that surprised me, and it's not everyone across the board, but by and large, the people that I've met in the industry have been supportive, helpful, open. I think the guys that have been in it a while understand that the building blocks here, we're dealing with 1950s technology. You know, it's not like, you know, so all you can do when you're talking about, you know, like a valve amp, right? All you can do is kind of come up with new ways of combining those building blocks. But at the end of the day, everyone's working with the same thing, and there's nothing new there. So I think that I've been very pleasantly surprised that the interactions have been, and I do this in comparison to the world I came from, which was, you know, corporate business world. It was enterprise information technology within the financial services world. And I worked in, you know, in Australia and Asia and in the UK. And it's an environment that is friendly but very competitive. And particularly within service providers that we would deem as competition, you know, everyone knew each other, and I would never say there's a lot of animosity or anything like that. But man, you didn't help the competition, and there was no sharing. Whereas in this world, when I have interactions with even the guys who are on my stream this morning, you know, Dave and Dan and Shay, it's nothing like that at all. You know, it's like, how can I help? Is the response that you get, and that's really blown me away. And I think that probably the differences that I would kind of connect it back to is that, by and large, people who are in this industry, and you can include the musicians in this as well, are doing it because they love it. They're not doing it because they have to do it. You know, whereas in my old world, most people are doing that. It's just work, you know. You enjoy work. You can still have work that you enjoy, but it's not their passion, not the same way that music is, you know. And, you know, like Dave I always talk about Dave, right? But one of the things that Dave joked with me at the beginning when we're getting to know each other, he's like, He's like, yeah. He said, you're not necessarily the thing you'd start because you want to make a lot of money. You know, you're doing it because you love it, right? And I was like, yeah, that's right. I was like, I'm not starting this as a second career because I'm thinking, hey, this is how I'm gonna, this is how I'm gonna retire early. No, you don't do it for that.
It's really interesting actually that you've had that previous career, and it's good that you can make a comparison between the two. Are there any kind of, I don't know, I mean, you've mentioned Dave quite a lot and different people, but are there any other, I don't know, maybe communities or online communities or things that you felt really stood out, particularly when you were starting and even now as, feeling like a real good sense of community?
Yeah. I think the community stuff is something I've had to get out and make those connections. So when you think about kind of the online stuff, the online world, I wouldn't say there are amp modding communities out there, and there is a lot of information that is shared. No doubt about that. But I wouldn't say it's quite critical. It's an environment where everyone's anonymous. You don't necessarily know who they are because it's, they have like stupid avatars and names and all that, right? You don't know who they are. It's like some people, you do figure out because you make a connection with them and then you get to meet them or whatever, and you realize, oh, you're that guy on that forum, But by and large, it's an anonymous world, and people just love to criticize things. It's human nature, isn't it? I don't know, but they do it in those worlds too. So I've had my stuff reverse engineered now. This is a kind of part of the evolution of my journey, is that I was one of those guys on those forums hoping like hell that someone would reverse engineer an amp that I was curious about, and then it would happen. And oh, wow, so that's what they're doing, It's not because you don't want to copy it verbatim, but you're trying to like going, oh, what was the thing that, you learn stuff, right? It's how you kind of learn. And then you find yourself, your design is now being reverse engineered and it's put on the internet, and everyone's hanging shit on you. You're like, oh, look at that, nothing magical about that. So it's kind of it's a weird dynamic. But the real community side comes from forcing yourself to get out there. So I think one of the things that I did, and this was right about 3 months before I quit work, I still had my day job, and I was right on that kind of like, am I going to do this? Am I going to launch into this full time or not? I still was mentally not quite there. And I got on the plane and went to the States. And it was very much like, it reminded me, when I remember doing it, it was just like, oh, this is kind of like my old world, because I did a lot of that. Get on a plane, go and visit customers, right? Go and visit prospects, try and sell stuff, like I do a mixture of like, site visits for existing customers, and you're trying to grow the account, and you're doing sales presentations to try and win new business and all the rest of it. And all those skills, one of the things that I realized from my previous career and everything I learned there, all of it was immediately transferable into this thing of running your own small business, whether it's understanding tax implications of having a US business and an Australian business, and foreign currency implications of all of that, managing supply chain, managing customer interactions, figuring out how to sell your stuff, all that, all that stuff, those skills that were learnt in the old world I was just like, oh, this is all the same. It's just a different product and a different industry and all the rest of it. So getting off your ass and getting out there and going to actually see people, that's, for me in Australia, because it's half, other side of the world from where you guys are, and just about as far to the United States as well. I had to do that. I had to get out there. And like, I remember, so Joe Barisi has become a really important connection for me, and a very good friend as well. The LA-based record producer. And that relationship, and obviously I've already mentioned Dave a bunch, it just like, I had some interaction with him because he was curious about Marshall mods. he wanted to mod a Marshall that he had built. He built a super lead from a kit, because he's the kind of record producer that likes to understand how everything works. Because if he can understand how it works to a degree, then he knows how to coax different sounds out of it. It's really, I've been spending enough time with him to kind of understand how he goes about it. His whole studio is all analog gear. You'd be hard pressed to find something digital in there. Yeah, he's got digital delays and things like that, right? But all of the kind of the stuff that generates tone and all his compressors and all that, they're all valve and analog and all the rest of it. And he, likes to twist the dials and he likes to understand how this works. So he discovered my YouTube channel because he wanted to mod Marshall that he built, and then he reached out to me and we started just direct messaging. But getting on the plane and going there, spending time with him, and then he introduces you to people, So I remember going in the first time I went and spent time with Joe. He's like, what are you doing tomorrow? And I'm like, I was still going to be in LA for a couple of days before I then flew out. Nothing. He goes, well, I'm going to breakfast tomorrow with Richard Fortus from Guns N' Roses. Do you want to come? Yeah, of course I do. So shit like that happens because you're there. It's crazy. I was like, Richard Fortus, that'd be cool. And George Trips was also there. George Trips was the guy that founded a pedal company called Way Huge, and Way Huge Pedals ended up getting acquired by Jim Dunlop, MXR, and he's the current product manager of MXR pedals. And so he was there as well. It's just like these industry contacts. And so you've got to get out there. The online community is not enough. It's like anything, I guess. You just have to get out there and kind of and try and make connections with people who will be important for you.
You've kind of answered partly this second follow-on question then. So how has your reputation or expertise kind of affected your recognition amongst other technicians, guitar players, producers? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, look, I'll try and answer that from how I think they think, but how they think I don't actually know. But I think that one of the things that I taught myself to do probably 5 years ago, when I was talking about this was a hobby and it turned into an obsession. Well, relatively soon in that progression, I realized that if I wanted to build the things that I felt I could do, I needed to learn how to do printed circuit board design. Okay, properly, and create these things, because you can't. It's very difficult, and I would almost say can't hand wire using point-to-point methods a more sophisticated amp. An amp with features, not just one sound. And if you look at any of the kind of modern stuff that's out there, from the 5150 through to the Engel stuff to Diesel to Bogner to the list goes on and on and on. They're all printed circuit board, right? For very good reason. So, being a solo independent guy, I don't know many of them that can do that. Really, not many. And some of them can, but they've grown, and they've over time grown into big businesses like Reinhold Bogner or John Suhr or whatever. Those guys can definitely do all that stuff themselves. They've just taught themselves it over the journey. But there's not many that can. So I think that what people probably see, what some of my peers see in me is that capability. I was like, oh yeah, he's got engineering skills, Mm-hmm. That's definitely a thing, and it's not necessarily very common. I do get a lot of feedback, it's quite regular feedback that is like, I'm an okay guitar player, which helps. I think it's helped me because for something, it has to be good enough that my test for something, whether it's, a modded Marshall or even my own stuff, right, is do I want to keep this amp? Do I want it? When it's at that level, I know that it's done. And if it's so, I play it. There are amp designers out there that don't play guitar.
Mm-hmm.
How that even is possible, I do not know. The engineers, they understand all the theory and how it all works, and they work with a team who obviously people in there can play guitar, whatever. But like there's a guy that worked for Fender that developed when the 5150 brand and the amplifier came out of PV and it went into EVH Fender. The guy that designed that first series of 5150s, not a guitar player. What? Jose couldn't play guitar. Dave always tells a story that he had a guitar hung on the wall and he would just like run his hand over the strings to make sure that the amp made a sound. That's it.
Yeah,
but he would rely on feedback from other guitar players, right? Obviously, and the best players in LA would be in the shop every day, no doubt. So I think being able to play a bit, I think helps. And again, not all the guys that are doing this are necessarily that handy with the guitar. A lot of them, not a lot of them, but there's quite a few of them that are like tuned to drop D, move the finger up and down on the play the chug riffs, and that's what they do, which is cool. Well, it's fine. I'm not criticizing that, but so I think the engineering thing and the being able to play a bit helps.
I mean, to be fair, like a bit of Australian modesty there. You play very well.
Oh, thanks, Dan.
Yeah, you're a kick-ass
I don't
player.
know. Yeah, like
such an Aussie thing. Oh yeah, all right.
Well, because one of the things that has happened about, I can guess it's Austin, probably a little bit back on your question about the community, is one of the things that has blown me away, and it's been a really nice experience for me, is that I've got to meet a bunch of musicians that it would never happen in a million years, like serious players. Like, and I'll just give you a quick example, like just in the last week, I haven't met this guy yet face to face, but just in the last week, I have been Tracy Guns from LA Guns.
Wow.
Found my YouTube channel, and he's at the moment clearly going through a phase of just like modded Marshalls, and he wants to learn about how these things work. Like, he's drawing schematics on it. He's sending me videos of him looking at a schematic and trying to describe what all the things do on it. And he says, if I got this right, Jason, what do you. So like all these little stuff like that's happened, and plus all like these weren't necessarily people that you'll know because, Dan, you might, right? But like guys like, you remember the band called Baby Animals?
Yeah.
Dave Leslie?
Yep.
Like
I remember them. Yeah. I remember them. They go over here as well.
Yeah. I mean, like
some of them got out. Yeah.
No.
Men at work, I think, as well, right? Yeah. Baby Animals.
Yeah. So like, there's just a lot of examples like that where there are bands and players that I listened to as a teenager or in my 20s that I know them, and I call them up tomorrow if I wanted to, whatever, right? And that's also like, the thing about the modesty about my guitar playing. Well, I've also, had the experience of sitting down and hearing some of these guys play through my stuff.
Mm.
Erwin Thomas, Jack Jones from the Southern Sons, and like,
yeah, right.
Simon Hosford. I don't know if you know Simon, man. He is just like, Simon used to play with Virgil Donati, the drum, and he played Simon when he was like 18 or something. Was Colin Hayes' guitarist when Men at Work broke up. He's got a career that's littered with all these little things like this, right? He's kind of like a sideman kind of guy. He's like the Pete Thorne of Australia. Simon lives about half an hour down the road here, right? And he's a really good mate of mine now. And I always knew who he was years ago. I remember seeing him at all kinds of bloody different gigs and stuff like that. And he just he's an incredible guitar player, and now he's a really good friend of mine, And I used to sit around at his studio and watched him, because I've used him on a few YouTube videos and stuff to demonstrate things. That's when you realize, I think, the modesty about the guitar playing, you realize where you are and you see these guys play and you go, oh yeah, that's right. That's what a pro guitar player does. Yeah.
And there's some 8-year-old on YouTube who's better than all of us. Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, that was my experience whenever I was going through my little shred period. I ended up sort of doing some demos at a guitar show in Dublin, but I went down there and I walked around and I saw some of the kids that were just blasting, and I was like, right, that's it, game over. I'm going to get into electronic dance music now. A lot easier. Jason, just just to follow up, you mentioned Joe Barresi and Tracy Guns and so on. Has your reputation, maybe of some of the classic mods like the Jose's and stuff, has that kind of built to your reputation, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I think those guys, somehow they discovered me, and I guess the YouTube thing is it's a massive part. The exposure that I've had and a lot of those connections have come from people discovering that channel. And the decision that I made, to start it, because I had no desire to go on YouTube. It's really? Put a camera on and talk to this thing and put yourself out there. I was terrified of doing it at the beginning. And anyone who bothers to go back and look at very early videos, and don't, by the way, you'll see it's pretty horrific. I remember the very first video I did, it was just the guitar, it was just cropped, where you didn't even know who it was, you couldn't play, and then eventually, then you start talking or whatever, and it's really kind of a bit kind of awkward. But I did it. I forced myself to do it because I realized the power of it from a marketing perspective. Because it's a worldwide reach, and again, you're in Melbourne, Australia, and I knew enough about business to realize that if I didn't have my addressable market as the world, this was never going to work commercially. And I'd seen there are amp manufacturers in Australia who didn't do that. With just kind of the local guys or whatever, and you can't have a business out of that. You can have a little side gig or whatever, right? Or you can be a repair guy. You can be the repair shop where people bring in all their amps for you to fix. But I never wanted to do that. I want a crap product, and I have done repairs. I've done heaps of them, but I've thankfully been able to kind of move out of doing that. Still do mods, because mods, we said before, right? Mods are fun, creative, and it's R&D.
Oh yeah.
And doing mods is also a way to building your customer base. Because if you do a Marshall mod for someone and they love what you do, they go, wow, I really like that sound. Then they'll come back and buy, more often than not, will come back and buy one of your own products, Or people will hear. That's why I often will I've done a lot with my YouTube channel, particularly in the early years, of showing how to do mods. No one I could find on YouTube was doing that. That's how, the Barresis of the world, the Tracy Guns and Dave Friedman himself, all those guys discovered me because they found this guy on YouTube who was actually showing how to mod a Marshall.
Yeah.
Not a lot out there. Your stuff on forums and so on. And maybe, someone's written things out and maybe a few photos or whatever. Normally, because what happens on the forums is someone's got their hands on a Cameron modded Marshall or a, Fortin modded Marshall or a Friedman modded Marshall or whatever, or a Langner modded Marshall. And they've taken photos of it and reverse engineered it or whatever. That's what you kind of get. But the video format, which is what YouTube obviously allows, is a whole different thing where, people can watch it without necessarily understanding anything about what you're talking about, but they're just fascinated by it anyway. And I remember I have, over the years, I've listened a lot to Pete Thorne's live streams. because I just think, I like his guitar playing. I love his tones. And I just think that his live format, he has just shared so much information. Like, because it's a Q&A thing, right? People ask questions and he just talks. He'll talk about, this is how you should get that tone. If you got that rig, I would hook it up like this. It's just, I just get have always got a lot of information from his stuff. One day, and this is right at the time when I was thinking about, do I do something with this YouTube platform? Someone asked him a question about, what's your advice, Pete? If someone was starting a YouTube channel up, by this time he had Pete's probably got 150,000 subscribers or something like that at this point. What's your advice? And his advice was, try and think of something or an angle that no one else is doing. Right? It's obviously in this industry. So you're going to have a guitar YouTube channel. Obviously going to be playing guitar. You're going to be talking about guitar, whatever. Right? You've got to try and think of something that is a different angle. Because otherwise you'll be in the noise, You're one of 1,000, 10,000, whatever it is that people are doing that. And that was what I dwelt, I kind of like stuck in my brain. And that was what I thought. I thought, no one's really showing how to do mods. Where, you because I talked before about, it's one thing to like go, I'm going to change this cathode resistor and I'm going to put this extra gain stage in or whatever, and you can draw it on a schematic and like, that'll deliver more gain or whatever. Then you got to implement it. That's the practical side. Figure out, how do I shoehorn this thing into what I've been given? The Marshall 2203 or the Super Lead or whatever. Showing that, I don't think there was anything on the internet that I could find where people were actually showing how to do that. So that's what I did. I did wonder whether I was going to get some hate, because I was like, and some people did, like, in comments on my videos, and other people that I've got, subsequently maybe emailed me or whatever, they've asked me that question, which was like, did you ever get any hate mail from the establishment? No, never did.
Super cool.
Oh, so you're showing everyone secrets,
That's so. Before we move on to Dan for the last two questions, that's so funny. That's exactly how I initially found you, Jason. Was that I can kind of wing electronics a little bit, but I was looking through, partly out of interest, but partly for this project to understand the mods. And then it was like, I wonder if anyone's done it on YouTube. Found you come up. And it was like, wow, this guy's too good to be true. He's giving away everything here in videos, right? And then I check a little bit more out, and it's funny because it kind of went through my head as well. It's like, wow, everything's been shown here, and great detail, great depth, and awesome. Yeah, it was absolutely brilliant, really, absolutely useful. For me, it was really quite funny, the story you've told. Yeah.
This was just me. I learned how to build tube screamers and then mod them with bass and treble controls, because I'd got the shits with tube screamers being too dark or too rolled off or something like that. Yeah. So I just wanted a little bit more control over it, and then started figuring out how to make pedals, and but then amps to me is a terrifying step, because there's death voltages involved.
Yeah, look, I mean, I never did pedals. I just went straight into amps. But I had obviously understanding of electronics, but I didn't understand. We didn't spend it when going back, so I hadn't done anything with this information for 28 years or whatever, 30 years since I'd graduated from uni, and at university we never looked at, valve. Well, we certainly never played with valve amps and stuff running at 450 or 500 volts DC. That just never happened. So there was that. Yeah, I was well aware of, like, oh shit, what could happen here. But it's not as, I don't know. I think if you're just methodical and not reckless, it's fine. And then you learn pretty quick. You get a couple of whacks and you go, okay, won't do that again.
Yeah. I guess I learned not to drink beer while I was soldering pedals, because the burns and the laziness that happens.
Yeah.
I better kick on with it. Otherwise, we'll be talking for all day for us and all night for you. How have historical Marshall modifications influenced other amp designs you're familiar with? I think you've really quite touched on a lot
probably
of
the Mike Soldano.
anyway.
Yeah, like the Soldano one's probably the like the Jose Arredondo and Mike Soldano are always the ones that stick out for me because the Jose thing just generated a whole line of style of mods which you don't even know, right? You don't even know that they're modded. They're not. People don't advertise these things as modded Marshalls. They advertise them as this brand name, this model. But when you look under the hood, you go, "Oh, okay, it's a variant on a Jose, whatever, right?" Which is fine. I'm not criticizing that because I've done the same thing. Or you've got the Mike Soldano thing, which is that gave rise to the 5150 and the Suhr Rectifier, which in turn have generated their own, things have been based on those amplifiers that have, they, again, you don't know. People don't necessarily know where they came from, but if you look under the hood, you can see, oh, this is a variant of a 5150, which came from the Soldano.
Yeah. So is there a golden era, a specific models or periods whose influence stands out in modern designs?
I'd say mid to late 80s. Yeah, without a doubt.
And who would be the modders at that time?
Well, those guys, yeah. And I think that was where, and if you think about kind of what was happening in rock music as well and heavy metal was, I think there was a move, there was a push. So what we had through, let's say through the 70s and into the early, let's call it the early 80s, were tube screamers and variations of into the front of Marshalls. Kind of that's the highest gain that you got. And that's a decent amount. It's Judas Priest level of, overdrive, which is fine, great even. But then there was this and it's kind of there's an arm. I sometimes use the term arms race, but there's this kind of we need, it goes to 11, and there's that guitar sound, and I think there's kind of around the mid, early to mid 80s. There's in that genre of music. There's kind of call it. It's not radio friendly metal, but it's like. It's mainstream metal, and you can, I think about the color, the bands, and obviously in Sunset Strip and all that at the time, where the guitar sounds became much more kind of produced sounding, less raw and more produced, more saturated, more compressed, and not as kind of pokey.
Yep.
And that's actually a big part of that transition of the sound is that you're getting more gain and more overdrive from the amplifier, and you get it's a less dynamic sound because it's, when everything's driven into distortion and clipping, it's like a big fat limiter that's been placed on the audio signal, right? Like a brick wall limiter that is like taking this nice dynamic audio signal and just squash the crap out of it, and it's like square wave. It's like if you looked at it you brought it up in a door, you could see it just looks like a big sausage. It's like there's no peaks and troughs, right? So that that kind of that sound, it's like that's where that kind of transition into much higher gain stuff started to happen, I think, and you could hear it in the music.
Cool. You bring up the thing of some mods are just, it started with the tube screamer in front of the amp, but we were talking a bit before about why not just throw a pedal in front of an amp? Why get a mod?
Yeah, interesting. I get asked this question. So it's one of the most common comments on my videos on YouTube. Oh, you could just do that with a pedal. is what the guy says.
Mhm.
Yeah. You can do that, but I think it's a different sound.
Mm.
Like a pedal in front of an amp's fine. I rarely do it. When I play live, I do, because it's useful to have that variation there, But when I'm playing at home, never. I'm always just into the amp because I don't want to. I mean, I just want the amp, right? Because that's what I'm exploring and working on. But it's a different sound, I think, because more often than not, what you end up modding, well, almost always, you're modding things that are through the preamp. A pedal is only obviously at the beginning, right? It's like way out front. And I know people put EQs and effects loops and so on, and that's kind of a different thing. But if you're talking about overdrive and gain, then putting a booster or an overdrive, an SD1 or a TS9 or whatever out the front, it delivers a certain tone, and it's a cool thing, but it's quite limited. Like it's one thing, and you can put it in front of different amps and then you'll get a different thing, but it's one, you can only do one thing. Whereas when you get into the amp and you got all these gain stages in front of you, you can decide, it's a whole smorgasbord of things that you can do, and each one of them will have a different characteristic.
Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, not only tonally, but also with the feel. I talked before about feel, Yeah.
So is there a difference with the voltages as well?
Yes. Yeah, 100%. I mean, and there are some preamp pedals that, will have voltage pumps and so on in them so that, even though you put a 9-volt adapter, it'll run at higher voltages internally. But, not at inside a tube amp, you were talking 200, 300, 400 volts DC. It's a whole different thing. So you can get a lot more amplification. It's what gain is, right? Gain is just amplifying. People use the term gain to mean distortion as well, and so it's a bit confusing. It's because it's the gain that gives rise to distortion, because you're pushing. Eventually you run out of headroom. The headroom inside a valve is massive, way more than inside a transistor running at 9 volts. So I think it's more dynamic. Yeah, to answer your question.
Brilliant. All right. Well, I guess that pedal discussion kind of leads us on to the inevitable thing of the rise of digital modeling. How do you see the future of amp modding and the amp modding community evolving with the rise of digital modeling technologies like amp sims?
Yeah, look, there's no doubt that the size of the market for tube amps has diminished and probably is continuing to. I don't have the stats in front of me, but but I think the opportunity there is for boutique brands to carve out their niche and keep a market share. Well, that's how I think about my stuff, and the ambitions for Headfirst is like, I have no ambition to become a mass-produced amplifier brand in a factory built by faceless people that are just turning up for work. Again, that model's fine. I'm not criticizing it, but it's not the business model that will work. And for the long-term future in this industry, because the digital modeling thing is taking a huge part of that market share. But I do believe it's like hi-fi. I think of this a bit like in the hi-fi equipment manufacturers. There's the mass-produced stuff that you'll go down and buy at JB Hi-Fi here in Australia or whatever it is, down at the high street, your local store or whatever. But then there's this whole other thing that happens in hi-fi where people are spending, crazy amounts of money sometimes, and that's a thriving industry in itself that operates kind of in parallel to the consumer market. And so when I think about the whole modeling thing and all that, I think that it's here and it's definitely getting better in terms of, the kind of tones that they produce. I don't think that they sound great. They sound great when you play them through, and I'm looking at here because I've got two studio monitors on either side of my screen here, and I can plug my XFX in here or my Quad Cortex or whatever, and I can play it, and I go, sounds pretty good. Sounds fine, right? But I haven't yet with a modeler, and I've tried them in all kinds of different scenarios with all kinds of different power amps. I have not been able to create an experience that's the same for me as a guitar player as that feedback loop that we were talking about before. You have a cranked amp and it's going through a 4x12 with Celestians, and it's coming back and through your guitar pickup, and you're feeling that whole thing's it's alive. You get a monitor and you turn it up with a power amp, it's not the same. So
I might just sort of dig into less sort of the playing of it, because obviously you play modelers a lot more, but more like how have the modding amp community like really pushed, because it feels, is there some sort of relationship there with like modified amplifiers and modelers?
Look, I don't think I think what we see in the modelers is we see a bleed through of modded amps that have been created and have carved out a reputation or a name for themselves will make their way into the modeling world. You know what I mean? I don't see anything going back the other way. I don't see any modders responding to, Helix just brought out the blah, 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 so now I'm going to create this thing. I don't see that. I see product evolution in the tube amp world to create offerings that can deliver similar outcomes as a modeler, like a tube or a valve preamp that has built-in digital cab sims and things like that, so you can use it direct front of house. And you see this in preamp pedals, and you see it in rack gear now as well, and you see that kind of technology in some amplifier heads as well. So like Victory have a line of valve preamp pedals that have built-in 2-notes technology that allows for power amp and cab sim. So you there is some, I guess there's some stuff coming back in terms of product development. But I think in terms of like modding to create different tonalities, I don't think there's much coming back from modeling.
Right. There is a follow-up here just about specific modelers, communities, or trends shaping that future. Have you seen anything like that at all?
Not outside of what we've already spoken about. Like, there's definitely a conversation that has come in the last year or two with the peers that I speak with, the other people in the industry that are going about doing this. That wasn't there, that wasn't part of people's regular conversations a few years ago, which is like the impact of modelers and what might it mean for what we're doing. And there's a mixture of reactions to that dilemma, which is like, and it ranges from, oh my God, tubes are going to die out. They're going to stop. Factories are going to stop making them. Blah blah blah. Just one end of the spectrum, all the way through to who bloody cares because they all sound terrible. And so, tube amps are always going to be there, and modded tube amps are always going to be there.
I mean, this might be slightly leading, but what about in terms of Kemper profiles and ToneX captures and this type of stuff? Have you kind of seen any of? Because I think there are some that will be kind of capture modded amps and so on. Have you kind of seen any feedback going on between the real amps and those? Have you any experience of that? How that's impacted the kind of modding scene, if at all?
Yeah, look, I think I mean that's definitely that capability. Look, I think you're right in terms of when you think about the digital world, there are two. There are two models out there. There's the like the Axe-Fx is a modeler, and then you have the capture devices which can actually take a photocopy. It's the way I think of it. Because it is like a photocopy. It's not quite. It doesn't have quite the fidelity of the original. And they sound awesome. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's like really bad, but I just always go back to the experience of playing it. It's not the same. I don't think that. I think that there is some of that stuff is seen as threatening. When you think about like the interaction between those two worlds, there is like the digital world can be perceived as being threatening to the analog world, because it's like if I don't know, Mike Fortin. I don't know this I'm just bringing his name up as an example, right? Mike's created his Evil Pumpkin amp or his Kelly amp or whatever. Now, you can now go onto the ToneX store or on God knows how many independent websites and buy captures of that amp. Now, does that mean that he's going to miss out on an amp sale? No one really knows. I would say probably not. I would say that person who's going to spend $10 on that amp capture is never going to spend $4,000 on an amp anyway. And I could also argue that if they get that profile and they fall in love with the tone, then they might start saving up for that $4,000 amp. So you can't hard to read that dynamic exactly, but
Do you think it's increased awareness at all of boutique amps and modified amps?
100%, because people have had some experience of playing it when for most people it's unreachable. It's one of the reasons why I actually got into modding. This is pre-digital modelers. Well, they certainly weren't prevalent. I figured out that I didn't need to buy these amps because I reckon I thought I think I could build one of these. You start small and you start with something simple, but then it doesn't take long. Well, it didn't take long for me before I realised that I don't need to go and spend because this stuff's expensive in Australia. Like a 100-watt flagship amplifier, like a Diesel or a Bogner or a Soldano or whatever, $6,500, $7,500, $8,000 here. Whereas if you source the parts yourself and you know what you're doing, you can put one of these things together for $1,000, which is what I did. Whereas so the modeling thing is like a lot of that stuff is unreachable for so many people for obvious reasons, but it does give you a taste of it. And I spoke to Mike Smith, who was another guy that's become a friend of mine. He's the founder of Omega amplifiers, or Omega Ampworks. They have the Rectifier and the Obsidian are the two main amp heads. Mike's the guy that introduced Jim Root to my stuff. Mike is the guitar tech for Mick Thompson in Slipknot, and Mick uses Omega amps. And when the band came to play Knotfest in 2023, Mike was with the band because he's Mick's tech. And he said to Jim, there's this guy in Melbourne that I know who's just released this new amp. It's a modded Marshall style amplifier. I think you'll like it. Would you like to try it when we get down to Australia? And Jim said, apparently, because Mike told me this whole story, Jim said, who is it? What is it? He said, don't worry, you've never heard of him. You never heard of it, but goes, I think you'll like it. Do you want to try it? Yeah, okay, fine. So that's how that whole thing happened. With that was obviously a big boost for the brand. For me, was getting Jim Root using the Alta, and he's now got 3 of them. Mike. So Neural DSP, who are the guys behind the Quad Cortex. Before the Quad Cortex came out, they have, and they still have, plugins. You run them on PC or your Mac or whatever, right? And they have the Omega Granifier Neural DSP plugin. You go to the Neural DSP's website, you can see it's there. You can buy it for, I don't even know what it is, $40 or something? I don't even know. When I spoke to Mike about this, because I was super curious, it's just this exact question, which is like, so man, you've got your amp, a digital version of your amp, and it's not a capture, it's not a third party, it's an official plugin, an official model, right? Signed off by Mike and the Omega team. And I said to him, is that taking sales away from you? I know you get a revenue stream from it, and it's a passive revenue stream, so that's really cool, right? Because you don't have to, once it's out there, it's just mailbox money, in any business, you need to have, you really want a business model where you have, passive revenue, right? Like if your business is only generating revenue from your own labor, clearly there's a ceiling on its growth. So anyway, so I said this to him, and he's like, it's increased sales, Jason. Wow. Because they get a taste of it and they go, far out, this thing's awesome. And then they want the real thing.
The gateway.
Exactly.
Awesome. Dan, have you got any follow-ups on that question?
No, I think that's the reason I bought an 1176. I played with the Universal Audio ones and I really loved it. And then
there you go.
Thought, I want me one of those.
Yeah, there you go. Same thing, right?
Yeah. I mean, I've just got discussion stuff because I'm an Aussie and just interested in a few things. Because you mentioned the Joe Barresi connection. Do you know Joe Malone from Brisbane, JLM Audio?
No.
I just think you guys would get on really well. He's he built a lot of the compressors that Joe Barresi uses and all that stuff. So he does like compressors, preamps, 1176 style things. Has an amazing thing called a Mac compressor, which is the best optical compressor I've ever heard.
I think now that you mentioned it, because Joe mentioned a couple of guys to me. I've been to visit him twice, and we actually exchanged emails yesterday. But the other one that I'm pretty sure he has mentioned that, and the other one was Open Plan Recording. OPR.
Mike Chiregio.
Yeah.
There you go. I mean, for your guitar miking up. Where is he? I think it's this one.
He had, when I was there, he had a prototype of a new design that Mike was working on.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, there you go. Look at that.
So this is a traditionally built U47 style capsule, but with the 8 micron mylar, so the thicker mylar, according to old spec, with a U87 body. So it's like 47 capsule, 87 body. It's my go-to vocal mic. It's stunning.
Sound amazing?
Yeah. It sounds. Yeah, it doesn't sound like a U47 or a U87. It's somewhere in between. So yeah, it's just a beautiful thing. Yeah, he's amazing. He fixed a bunch of my old 67s as well. And yeah, so yeah, I mean,
because those are guys. It's funny, like outside of. I mean, they're kind of in the bigger industry, but they're not in the guitar. So he's on the other side of Melbourne. Like he's not exactly down the road, right, but he's here in the same city, and we've never met.
Right.
I've reached out to him and said, "Hey, man, we've got a connection in common with Joe, and it's just great to connect." And he was super friendly, but we've never It's like I don't know. That's kind of like it's an adjacent thing. It's like it's a related industry, but it's not necessarily the same thing.
Yeah, definitely. Cool mics though. I think he would really actually like to do like a shootout with your amps and his mics. He'd be into that.
Cool.
He's quite a tinkerer and a geek. When you get him talking, he won't stop. He's got the same level of passion that you've got for amps about vintage microphones.
Yeah, I bet he does. I follow him on Instagram, and I just love he's always taking like really close up pictures of like little caps and resistors and capsules and shit like
drilling
that.
holes in capsules. Yeah, amazing.
He's crazy.
Jason, we don't want to take up too much more of your time, but we've just got a question. Actually, it's quite a leading question, so we kind of leave it to the end. Why do you think that Marshall didn't pick up in the whole modded thing? Particularly during the 80s, and why did it take so long? Have you got any thoughts on that?
Man, it's a really good question, and I don't. I mean, I thought that too, right? I thought like, and I remember speaking with them. I don't know exactly why, but I've got maybe some insights that might be helpful. Again, one of the relationships that I've made, connections that I've made in this relatively short time is Santiago. God, why can't I think of his last name? Really well known. Like he designed the JVM.
Yeah.
And I did a bunch of live streams in late 23 on the channel, about 15 in a row, and I got a different designer in for each one. And Dave came on, and I had Mike Smith from Amiga and a bunch of guys, and he came on. The insight that I got from him, and he worked 10 years there. He did the AFD 100, the slash amp, and he did the milestone amp, and the JVM was his kind of like signature thing, Amazing engineer. Now, the thing that I learned from him was that, and I guess it's not surprising, he said it's quite a big company. Well, he said they probably act like a bigger company than they actually are, and maybe it comes from tradition. And by that he meant slow moving.
Right.
How like corporations can become big ships, right? And they very hard to turn around. And he described it a little bit like that, and that just came up in conversation because he was talking about when you set about designing a product in that environment, right from the get-go, you're actually kind of boxed into a pretty narrow paddock because you have to use the existing supply chain. It's kind of how he described it, right? Like these are the transformers that you can use. These are the capacitors we have. This is our manufacturing capability. Whatever product you come up with, it has to conform within those constraints. And of course, there's this whole cost overlay that comes in terms of like what's the cost of this product going to be, and what's the price point. There's corporations, right? You get everything from marketing to finance, all involved in the conversation about what this thing's going to be or what it needs to be. And he's just like, I just want to build something that's going to sound amazing, and have these features. And so you end up with this kind of lots of stakeholders, and it becomes wrapped around the axle. And that's not a criticism of Marshall. I think that's just a reality of any company that is matured. I certainly found that a lot in my old world. So I think that's probably has a lot to do with it. That in that kind of environment, product development can be really difficult, particularly to see a product, see it all the way through to it coming out. It takes a huge amount of tenacity and dedication. And I think in organizations that when you have founders that are still there and they're driving that product evolution, it happens because it's largely probably still their business. Maybe they've sold down shareholding or whatever, and they might not have a majority shareholding, but they have, they have an ability to get stuff done in an organization. So I think back to the Marshall thing is that, like, with Jim Marshall passing and kind of like not necessarily, maybe they didn't have the same kind of drive that you get from a founder. Product development became difficult, and then product development then gets driven by employees. But again, it's a valid thing. Of course, it's fine, but it's not necessarily the same kind of passion that you get from a founder.
Yeah, I mean that lack of agility was definitely something. But it's funny that that from Ed Van Halen, George Lynch, all these guys, and that stuff was massive at the time. They just couldn't get the traction to go, right, actually let's put out something that's literally just a Jose mod, right, or whatever it is, and take it from there. It was really quite interesting, actually, and how they just couldn't kind of shift. And it's something that we've talked about when we set up this project, is kind of like, okay, what kind of happened there? Where was this massive period of kind of like, a kind of the JCM 900 might have been. I mean, it's funny you're talking about. I managed to get the old guitar player magazines and Guitar for the Practice of Musician magazine. Someone uploaded those onto like a Google Drive, and it's kind of funny. I was looking back as part of this, and looking at the advertising and looking at what's going on, and you can actually see there's a few little adverts. It's probably from Mike Soldano at the time, for his hot rod mod start to pop up. I can't remember at what period it is. Yeah. But in the markers and for when they bring out the JCM 900, it is kind of hinting at this. It's kind of hinting, right, you want more gain, you want this, but you don't need to mess around with mods, and you want Marshall anyway, so we're kind of giving it to you. There's a bit of marketing goes on around that time, which is quite interesting. But I think that was like 1991, 92 or something like that.
Yeah, I think so. I think you're right, and I think so. It was a bit late to the party, and then by then we'd already seen in terms of. Mike's probably the first one to capitalize on it, right? Which he moved into what was clearly a space in the market that wasn't being filled, which was like an amp that you could buy at a store that was already modded. Like you didn't have to buy a Marshall and then take it in somewhere and get it done. You could just go and buy it, and it was already like that. And then obviously you've already spoken about what happened subsequently with the dual rectifier. And I think the 900 is like, maybe at the time, certainly the reputation of that amplifier today, and I don't actually know what people thought of it back then, but it's not the greatest sounding amp.
Well, what's actually funny about that is that Jason Becker, there's an interview with him when he was recording the guitars for that David Lee Roth album.
Oh yeah.
And it's really quite funny because I've got that recently, and if you were to ask me about a guitar style, the rhythm that he plays in that Little Lean and Off song, that is just my style of rock guitar playing.
How good is it?
It's unbelievable.
I know exactly the track.
Awesome. Yeah. But he actually says that he's talking about recording the album. He says, "Oh yeah, we had some modded Marshalls, blah blah blah." Bob Rock brought his Marshalls in, and he said we had the new JCM 900s, and they sound great. And I think we used them quite a lot in the album. Then there's another interview with Steve Vai. It's after Passion of Warfare, and I can't remember what it is. He's been interviewed about. It's kind of funny because he was talking about like making a book or something, not a tab book, but he was on about making a book out of Passion Warfare at the time. But he also says that he's got some 900s in the studio, and he thought they sounded good as well, which really surprised me because I thought the same as you, that at the time, they obviously retrospectively they've got a pretty bad reputation, but at the time people must have liked them, which is funny.
Well, I think and I think it also it's probably important to remember that. Certainly for a lot of people, they wouldn't have had a reference point either. they wouldn't have had like an amazing sounding amp necessarily to compare it to. So it just would have been like, well, this thing has gain and it sounds, it's kind of, you know, like it's in the ballpark, you know?
Yeah.
Now that we can look back on it and like, you know, we can be really critical of it, but perhaps at the time it was like, I can imagine people saying it's pretty good. Yeah. I don't know, man. Like the modded thing. I mean, and to do it now, like eventually, now they've come up with the modded series, is, you know, I don't question. I mean, I obviously question how long it took, and if you're going to do it, then you know, do it. I think the mods themselves are pretty pedestrian. Like my understanding, and I have seen the screen grabs around on the internet, because Marshall surprisingly have shown in their marketing literature, their videos and stuff, they're showing shots of the insides. So you can see it. You know, you pause the video and you can tell a hell of a lot by just looking at it. And I know a little bit about, you know, what they've done. There's just like, it's just you can just figure it out. They're not very gainy, you know, like there's some, it's modded a bit, you know, maybe it's 20% more, whatever, but it's not like, if you look at the kind of Marshall mods that someone like Dan Gower is doing in the UK, whole different hemisphere, just a whole different ballgame. And I remember speaking, when we had heard that Marshall were in development with this modded range, it was, the rumors were there, you know, everyone kind of knew it was happening. Everyone in the industry knew it was happening. We didn't know what they were doing. But what we were most curious about is who they were doing it with.
Yeah.
And quite a few of us were speculating that Dan Gower, they'd hired Dan.
Would have been, man.
He would have been amazing there.
Yeah. But they didn't.
And they would have slayed, like, because his stuff's awesome, you know? Like, he does, it's the real deal, you know?
Yeah.
But no, I remember when I finally got, I mean, because I didn't really know Dan that well. I know him reasonably well now because he's been on the channel heaps, and we do actually chat. And I asked him, I told him that story. It's probably 6 months ago. I said, man, I just assumed that they'd hired you. He's like, nah, phone never rang.
So why do you think they brought out the modded series now? Do you think there is a bigger awareness of modded amps? You know, do you think something's happened?
I actually think that happened on the back of the change of ownership. So if the company Zounds, or however they pronounce it, hadn't acquired that business, so these are the guys that ended up with the contract to make the headphones and all the Bluetooth speakers and all that.
Oh yeah.
Right, and then the size of that business became like 10 times the size of Marshall, because the amount of, you know, revenue that's in consumer products versus guitar amps.
Yeah.
And then they became so big that they just bought Marshall, and so they own the Marshall brand. And this was about 2 years ago, somewhere around there, give or take. And I just think that they, you know, new owners in town, they're just like, you guys haven't released a new product forever. The only thing, they're probably, I could imagine the conversation around the boardroom table. What have you actually done in the last 5 years? And someone says, oh, we've released the Studio Series amps, little ones. Yeah, but they're just reissued. That's not new. All you've done is you've taken your old circuit from the 70s and put it in a smaller box. You know, what else can we do? Someone would have, I could just see it happening, right? So I think it's happened on the back of that change of ownership, and now it's changed owners again. Yeah, so I understand there's a Chinese-backed private equity company that now has taken a controlling stake, if not all of the business, and you could reasonably expect. In my old world, I was with a publicly listed company that got delisted because it was taken over by private equity. And then it relisted again on this Australian Stock Exchange 5 years later. And that time when private equity were involved in the business, they pushed the management team, of which I was part of, they pushed it so hard because they've now invested, right? And private equity only wants one thing, as a return.
Yeah.
So they just lit the blowtorch and just put us under it. And so I would reasonably expect that that's what's going to happen now with Marshall. So we should see a more rapid. We don't know what. I don't know what they're going to do, where they're going to go. They're going to go into digital modeling, or who knows, right? But I imagine that what will happen is a push to do more and do it more quickly.
Yeah. I'd be surprised if they don't go into something, like Dave's IRXs or those type of things, or
that would be cool.
Would suggest the type of thing that they would do, actually. So you no regrets then, Jason, about stepping out of the old world into the new world then?
No, look, you have moments of this is hard.
Yeah.
It's hard running a small business, and I'm not, it would be in any industry if you're just have to do the whole thing yourself, because there's one of the things about my business model which makes it work commercially is that it's direct sales. There's no intermediary, right? I'm not selling through retail. I'm selling direct via YouTube and the website. So there's no middleman, and that's great commercially, but it means that customer contact, it's you, right? It's it's me. It's like there's no one else dealing with that customer. So, and that's can be quite rewarding, but it can also be quite challenging because you're dealing with everything from pre-sales inquiries to the buying process itself, to then fulfilling the order, and then they get the amplifier. And sometimes you never hear from them, which is cool. Sometimes you get glowing feedback, like this is the best amp I've ever had, and that's amazing to hear. And then sometimes you get, well, I've got this problem, and can you help me troubleshoot it? Of course, you've just spent this money with me, so I'm more than happy to help. And then you basically building a rig for them because I don't know how to plug it all in, and and then very occasionally, you get the disgruntled customer, who for whatever reason is not happy with the result. So you got to deal with all of that, So, but look, I constantly tell myself that it's like it's still better than it's more fulfilling than what I was doing. Yeah. In terms of just my own, just happiness in what I'm doing, and just doing something for yourself rather than working for a company. It's just, that's a nice change, So I've got no regrets because I knew that if I hadn't done it, I'd still be sitting there thinking about the what if scenario,
Yeah. Well, it looks like you've made the right decision because, everything's going in the right direction for Headfirst, and, all the work you're doing, and for that sound and those type of amplifiers is absolutely awesome. And again, I'd like to really thank you for just taking part today. Oh, Dan's just coming in. I think we can have Dan for the final few words.
What's up? Sorry, just managed to jump back in.
We're just about to part, Dan.
Oh, lovely.
So yeah, thanks. I mean, really appreciate you taking the time, Jason, today. And I can just tell you right now, it was an absolutely awesome interview. There were so many things, so much stuff to go through, and it's one of those things. It's a blessing and a curse because now we've got to spend hours going through everything because there's so many notes. Excellent. Okay, thanks so much, Jason.
Thank you, mate.
I'll find that link for those PDFs.
Oh yeah. And
you should have good fun. Should have good fun with those little time capsule. And we need to stay in touch. And if anything comes up, you're over here, let us know. And it's been a real pleasure speaking with you today. Absolutely, absolutely. So thankful, and thanks for being
thank you so much.
Quick and getting back and easy to organise things with. It just makes life so much easier.
Yeah, no sweat.
All right. Cheers, Jason.